is a nonprofit community land trust for neighborhood forest gardens with member sites in Dorchester, Jamaica Plain, East Boston, the West End, and Mattapan. Altogether, it has developed and maintained 13 food forests, wow, on formerly vacant lots in 8 Boston neighborhoods. And the BFFC organization has planted more than 400 plus fruit and nut trees and shrubs at community-controlled spaces like the Eagleston Community Orchard in Roxbury, where neighbors grow berries and organize arts and community events. You can learn more about their work at bostonfoodforest.org. So the Old South Church Climate Change Task Force is incredibly excited about this organization and their focus on urban farming, sustainable agriculture methods, education, and doing all of this work within environmental justice communities. Additionally, the Food Forest Coalition offers opportunities for people to get involved, a little dirt under your fingernails, by volunteering as individuals, as a group, or as a family. So lots of ways to stay connected. We encourage so there's a note about a short survey. I don't actually have the survey, unfortunately. I am switch hitting at the last minute. But if you're interested, please talk to one of us on staff here. And also feel free to connect with Orion and share an idea about your interest. Let's see. We're delighted to have Orion here. Please, we encourage you to ask questions. If you're attending remotely, you can write your questions in the chat and we'll read them aloud. I'm just going to check in with our folks here. How's it look, William? Getting there. Okay. Shall we go ahead and start talking while Orion, is that okay with you if we start talking even as the presentation is taking shape?
Yeah, you can see the first slide here, right? Sorry, you can see the first slide here. Well, thank you so much for the introduction, first of all, and it's really a pleasure to be here and to be speaking with you. For me personally, the whole process of this work, which I'll explain in the presentation, is about community, and we're in community as we're sort of tackling these challenges of our times. So it's really an honor to be able to be here and share what we're doing and why we're doing it, and I feel supported in the invitation alone just to be here, so thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful. Maybe before your presentation begins, you can tell us a little bit about how you got started in this work.
Yeah, I mean, and that is...
it looks like we're ready. Jamie, are we ready? Yeah. William, are we ready? Awesome.
So
Take it away,
I will
Ryan.
definitely touch on that as I go through the presentation. Will you give me some sense of time? How
Absolutely.
Yeah?
Yes. Right now it is about 5 after.
Okay.
And you have, I would say, a good half an hour.
Half an hour.
With
so
enough time for us to take questions. So
yeah.
you just...
Yeah, I really love the question and answer part, and I also have a tendency to be a storyteller, and there's a lot to share, so hopefully there's a good balance here today. And in terms of how the slides will progress, will I just ask you at some point to, how does that work?
William, are you okay to advance slides?
Okay, William, thank you. So let's just go back to the first one, sorry. We're starting here with not burying the lead. So we're going to back into this a little bit more through the presentation. But the lead is that Boston Food Forest Coalition, which has been around for about 6 years, has had a lot of success. And what you're looking at here in this image is we're looking down at the recently completed Ellington Community Food Forest in Dorchester in the Four Corners neighborhood. And we have the ambitious but achievable goal over the next 5 years to create 35 more food forests protected in the Community Land Trust. It's ambitious because each food forest is a multiplicity of relationships and stakeholders. And so it's really, to do this work authentically, there's no cookie cutter approach. And to really involve all the voices of stakeholders in a process takes years. This food forest took at least 3 years of conversation before we even broke ground. And in terms of fundraising and all of that sort of those pieces of it. And then once we broke ground, it was like another year to construct it. And our goal as an organization is to raise the growth capital that we can be here in perpetuity as a community land trust, responding to all the community inreach that we get every year, because more people approach us for support and help with food forests than we have the ability to respond to. And so we're trying to get from 3.5 staff people to a full complement of about 10 folks in a thriving nonprofit. So there's ambition here, but we're well on the way. There's momentum as well. And before we move on, let me just describe a little bit what you're looking at so you have a sense of this. But this is a good example of a lot of different elements that we like to see in a food forest, but we don't see all these elements in every food forest. So in the middle, you see the array of raised beds. That's more like a traditional community garden situation. Raised beds are important because soil is contaminated in the city because we had lead in the gasoline for so many years, so that acted as like an aerosol spray that infected anything near roads. Anything where cars were driving by has significant lead levels in it. One of the interesting things about fruit trees and nut trees, for the most part, there's some exceptions, but mostly, especially with fruit trees, woody perennials in general, the fruiting body does not uptake metals. The plant doesn't put the metals into its reproductive organs, essentially. So we know this. It's been tested by, I think it was like Boston College or Boston University for urban gleaning purposes. So we just know that one of the things that's cool about our approach to urban agriculture is that these trees are completely safe in terms of the food that they produce. And along the margins of the site is really where the fruit trees are, and there's a pollinator garden there, and that's true in the back, which is cut off a little bit, and along the shadowed side as well, and in the front, which is also cut off in this image, the fruit trees sort of border this particular food forest. And then there's these community elements. There's the sandbox for kids to play in. There's the handicap accessible pathway to the gazebo. There's the shed. There's a community bulletin board, which you can't see. So there's all these different pieces of it that really make it come alive as a park. And there's, you can sort of see the rusted barbecue station right there near the gazebo. So a lot of community events and things that happen that make it come alive. And it's a vibrant cultural space as well as a food producing space. So now let's go on to the next slide. So at the intersection of equity and climate resilience, the Boston Food Forest Coalition works with neighbors to transform vacant lots into locally run public food forests protected by our community land trust. And this presentation will really be unpacking that mission statement. But first, let's take a step back in the next slide. And let me just introduce myself a little bit more. This is an image of my oldest daughter when she was 3 years old in our yard in Eggleston Square. If you know Eggleston Square, it's a very dense neighborhood. Houses are packed together and there's not much space, so we have a narrow strip of land in our yard, and we were able to plant there raspberries, blueberries, strawberries, cherries, grapes, juneberries, gooseberries, kiwi, as well as all the sort of like annuals, the oreganos and the rosemary and the lavender and the thyme and the tomatoes and the garlic and Egyptian walking onions, and I could go on. So in a very small space, we packed in a lot of food, and that is definitely part of what you'll see some other images around, but that's part of the vision and the mission. It does look kind of wild, and that's also very intentional. It's fun for kids to explore and be able to walk through and pick what they want and eat it. And for me, the reason why I start with an image of my daughter is so you understand that this work for me is deeply personal. This is a crazy time on Earth in many regards, right? So we're dealing with a moment where the decisions we make in the next couple of years even, but definitely within the next decade, will shape the outcome of life on Earth for generations to come. And we didn't ask for that burden, but we have it anyway. So this is an intense moment to be alive, and it's an intense challenge to rise up and try to meet. And for me personally, my background is more rooted in Judaism, and we have a phrase there called tikkun olam, which is to repair the world. And I take this work sort of from that spirit. And I want to say too, like, I didn't start off doing horticulture as a profession. My professional background is I worked for 10 years at the Tellus Institute, which is a think tank here in Boston that works on sustainable development internationally. And I spent a long amount of my professional life writing position papers and talking to scholars and activists and going to climate change conferences all over the world and trying to sort of say, how can we engage this from a policy level? And if you go to the next slide, this is where I came into the work when I was like 10,000 feet up in the air doing this policy work, I was also living in the neighborhood of Eggleston Square. And around the corner from my house, as you can see this chain link fence, that's what the vacant lot used to look like. It had in it a lot of like what vacant lots tend to collect. So you have tires and old TV sets and nip bottles. And Eggleston Square has a long history of being a heroin market. So you had a lot of needles in it. And it was a trash lot. And it was overgrown. And I remember going door to door to my neighbors and saying, what's the story here? What happened? And a house had burned down about 35 years ago. And I said, well, what do people want to see here? And some of the sort of like younger teenagers younger adults that I spoke to had been teenagers, and they had like played baseball in that space, but you can see how close it is to the buildings. It's never going to be a baseball diamond. And so we just started a conversation with people in our neighborhood, neighbor to neighbor. It helped that I spoke Spanish and that I had spent some time living in Guatemala. People were very friendly in general. There was a lot of life on the street, a lot of neighborhood connectivity. The neighbor across the street from here, would repair people's cars in his driveway, that type of thing. So it was a very open conversation, and neighbors started to show up and contribute, sort of in a Stone Soup style. Some neighbors worked in a greenhouse, essentially, and they had heirloom apple trees that they couldn't sell because they'd been mislabeled. So we planted those. These are the big tree that you see there. Not the tall oak tree behind it, but the bigger trees in front there. And so that was really great. And other neighbors had currant bush in their yard, and they dug that up and they brought it here and they planted here. And the picket fence that we ended up installing in the front was the local Mendel Elementary School, and their art teacher and every student got a board and painted it, and then their families came and installed it. So very much a Stone Soup process of creating this space. And as it happened, the neighborhood came together. Some of the images on the bottom, you can see, this was a meeting ground in a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood of people of diverse backgrounds in terms of, we often don't connect, even though we're overlapping geographically, but in this space, people would actually connect across race and class and language and other urban divides. And, around things like the apple cider pressing that the kids love, or face painting, or the barbecues and the events that we have in this space. And so another thing that happened while we were creating this space is a young man in the neighborhood was murdered, shot and killed on the street right in front of the space. It was the first year that we as a community were out there cleaning it up and sort of brainstorming what to do with it. And we came out one day, like the day after the killing had taken place, and his family was there, his friends and family, mourning and holding a candlelight vigil. And we brought them soup and water because we had heard that you have to stay hydrated when you're mourning. And then we invited them to plant a blueberry bush in memory and say some words in memory. And then we hung on the chain link fence a little piece of cloth and wrote pause on it, P-A-Z, which means peace, and invited them to share, their own messages on the cloth. And still to this day, this is now 11 years later, that altar is recreated every year. And so for me, it became a real clear thing that this is much more than growing food. This is growing relationships between ourselves and the land, between ourselves and our diets, and between each other.
Thank you. So those of you that are just joining us online, we're talking with Orion Krigman, who's the Executive Director of Boston's Food Forest Coalition. Thanks, Orion, please.
Yeah, the next, oops, how did that get in there? Keep going. So here's another image of the same space. You can see it looks kind of wild and overgrown. The grapevine there is really shaggy. That's intentional. This is an example of what we could also call agroecology, ecological agriculture, urban agroforestry. It's permaculture design principles that create this space, in part to sort of mimic nature, and I'll share a little bit more about that as we go through this. But basically, we're creating community parks stewarded by neighborhood volunteers. They're filled with fruit trees, shrubs, raised beds, as well as local art, cultural events, and habitats for wildlife, for birds, for beneficial insects, for the native bees, which are endangered, the monarch butterflies, and other pollinators. In the next slide, So what is a food forest? And I'm going to go through and I'm going to explain how a food forest is a garden, an intention, an adventure, a seed, and a beacon, and then we'll open it up for questions. So this is the rest of the presentation here. Next slide. So a food forest is a garden. I think that's the first thing to hold in mind, is that there's a book written by two folks out in Western Mass, Dave Jackie and Eric Tonesmeyer, called Edible Forest Gardens. It's a 2-volume set. It's a textbook. It's incredibly detailed about the ecology of these spaces. And so we're not inventing the concept. We're taking that idea and we're applying it here in Boston. And it's gardening as if we are a forest. It's not gardening in a forest. It's not like we're creating a forest in Boston somewhere. These are spaces that are designed for human use, and it's human choices that determine what gets planted. And that's true about the entire city, obviously. So we think it's particularly well suited to the challenges of urban lots, where you have irregular access to water and sunlight and sometimes pudding stones in the middle. And so you're not going to easily create a large, continuous urban farm. I mean, there's some spaces in the city for it, and Boston's a real pioneer in urban farming. But this is a form of urban agriculture that doesn't mimic farming, but mimics nature and still produces food. I think let's go to the next slide. So the important thing to remember is that it's not a cookie cutter approach, and there is a real range of elements that can be found in a food forest, from espalier trees, which is a very formal thing, very common in Europe, to more wild-looking pollinator spaces, to more cultivated spaces, to like a children's exploratorium sort of sensory experience. So let's go to the next slide. This is an example of the new food forest at Old West Church, and since we're here at Old South Church, I thought that might be an interesting sisterly relationship and something to look at. You can see Old West Church is a historic church, and it has a historic church yard, so they wanted some of that wild energy, but in contained ways, right? So you can see that it's very planned in that regard, and still quite beautiful, and still quite abundant, and still very much mimicking nature. And then the next slide. This is that same Ellington Community Food Forest that we saw from an aerial view. Now we're looking at it from the street view. And you can see this has a lot of abundance, and it's just sort of bursting forth with energy. It actually won an award for the best new garden from the trustees and the mayor. And it was really, again, this is the point about design, is like it's designed towards community goals. So the community had a vision of food as medicine, of hyper-nutritious perennial foods being medicinal just because of their nutritional quality, but also of planting, we have an herbal mandala where the different herbs are planted for different body systems, the digestive system, the respiratory system, so people can come and make teas. And there's even things like elderberry, where you can make elderberry syrup from it. So that was very much part of the community vision. And as I'm saying, there's not a cookie cutter. So everything, when you design towards the goals. And who articulates the goals? It's the stewards, the people who are going to volunteer and maintain the space on behalf of the rest of the neighborhood. Let's go to the next slide. So this is Carolyn McGee. She was on our board for a number of years. She had to step off. She actually lost some family members during the COVID crisis, and has been struggling with all of that. But here's a quote from her. "This isn't just a garden where people can come to harvest. It's a garden where people can come to bond. There's a lot of community building here. People are making friends, children play, they learn about strawberries and different herbs. It's really a learning, working garden for the community. It's such a beautiful space. It's so calm and peaceful and so healing. It's our space and we're so proud of it." And that continues to be the spirit and the energy that we find again and again as these spaces take shape and take form. It's not if we build it, they will come. It's not like we're top-down installing a community garden in a neighborhood. That's never been the spirit of the Boston Food Forest Coalition. We emerged from different guerrilla gardens and neighbors coming together who said, how do we protect these spaces in our neighborhood? How do we control the destiny of development in our neighborhood? And we realized we needed to own the land in order to do that, and so we created the Community Land Trust with that intention. And that continues to be the spirit of our work, even as we're trying to establish ourselves as a nonprofit and all the challenges within the nonprofit sector that that implies. So I said it's a garden, it's also an intention. And I think this is a beautiful intention. And every food forest is a tangible expression of this intention. It's a way to encounter this intention in a direct, meaningful way in a city where everything is shaped by human decisions. Here is another example of a space that is shaped by human decisions, only this time with the intention to align our civilization with nature and to come back into harmony with creation. And I think, yeah, thank you. As one example of the challenge of this is that we see in conventional agribusiness a socially inequitable system that exploits the developing world, degrades soil and destroys ecosystems, reduces biodiversity, steals and mismanages water resources, contributes massively to climate change, creates wealth disparities, and still causes hunger, malnutrition, and obesity, where 1 in 7 folks in the US are food insecure. And there's obviously a tremendous racial justice component to all of this. So how do we move? How do we move away from a system that is incredibly efficient and useful for on-demand restaurant menus, but as we're experiencing now with supply chain shortages and COVID, it's also very brittle, and especially as climate change intensifies, very vulnerable to perturbations. And one of the things that we know is we need to rebalance our food systems to be more regional. We have to go back to some redundancy in the system, not only valuing efficiency. And we know that, in the big picture of doing that, urban agriculture has a role to play in regional food systems. And I'm not going to go into in this presentation, but Food Solutions New England has a regional food vision, which if you're not familiar with it, is worth checking out, the New England Foods Vision, where they do talk about how we're not going to get from here to there unless we repurpose suburban and urban spaces in part to be food-producing spaces. So let's go to the next slide. So when we think about how to deal with the challenge and we look to nature as our model, we really see that, it's community that matters here, that all the microbiota, the fungi, the bacteria, the intercropping of species, instead of vast monocultures, having polycultures, that this is, let's go to the next slide, that this is really what is been studied as ecological agriculture or agroecology by the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. And it's a knowledge-intensive process, but it produces more per acre or more per square foot than conventional agriculture does. And it's, according to the UN studies and reports, it's capable of feeding the entire world population. The question is, can we take it to scale? And so one piece of this work is that, in Boston, most of us don't know what the opportunities are, what the solutions are. So we're not going to change the entire food system in Boston, but we're going to introduce people when they encounter these spaces to alternate ways of doing things. We're going to invite people to ask questions, and in that, we're going to build a constituency for political transformation, hopefully. So let's keep going. So Food Forest is also an adventure. It's an adventure in the science of agroecology. It's a deep dive into perennial native plants, which most of us are just learning about again, and even the science of that is still we're on the frontier of it. It's a deep dive in that sense because the climate's changing and we're not sure what is going to grow as the climate changes. But it's also an adventure in human community. And I'm going to try to go a little faster. So, as I mentioned earlier, we live in challenging times. And a food forest invites us to exercise a muscle that I think is relatively weak in our culture, which is that of stewardship, that of caring for the commons, that of acting collectively in collective work days, taking that same energy that we might put into an individual garden plot in a community garden with a waiting list and a locked gate, and transforming that into an open public park that's edible and accessible to all visitors and all Bostonians. And showing that actually that's fun to do, that exercising that muscle is not just work, it's actually, there's a lot of joy. And so let's go through some of these next slides here. Yeah, there's dramatic inequality in a city like Boston, so the next few slides talk to that. So part of this Human Community Challenge is addressing the history of racism and inequity and the challenge of the access to green space. So we know that neighborhoods impacted by racist redlining are like 3 or more degrees hotter in the summertime and have 16% less parkland. So the urban heat island effect, especially this year and one of the hottest summers on record, is intense, but it's particularly intense to the most vulnerable among us. So that's part of this adventure, is how do we tackle and face into our history and try to heal from that. And so we really see our work at the intersection of equity and climate. And housing land trusts historically are focused on the equity piece. Conservation organizations historically focus on the environment piece, but we really see the two together as the path of community resilience. And critically, local leadership matters in this. And what we find is that in building these gardens, people who have been burnt out or cynical or who haven't stepped into leadership do. And then that cascades into other things that then have ripple effects throughout the community and other ways that people get involved with the city of Boston acting on Greenovate or other climate solutions. Let's keep going, because we're also, I think it's important to think about how a lot of us are encountering climate change for the first time and the anxiety that produces. Like, I've been immersed in this for decades, and it's interesting to me that finally people are catching up with the intensity of what's going on. And one of the things that happens is people go from not paying any attention to just complete despair and giving up. It's like they forget about the fact that we're still on the field and the game hasn't been lost yet. Like, we gotta face into the challenge. And so I think one of the ways to tackle that anxiety is to take action. And the scientists who study climate change talk about this all the time, like just small actions. Even if it's not in and of itself going to solve the whole problem, it starts to transform our energetic relationship with the challenge and opens up avenues for more action and more community building. So people coming together across race and class and language barriers to plant these new gardens in public and private spaces. This is a private yard. This is what we call a garden raising, like an old-fashioned barn raising. Neighbors coming together and banging out a new permaculture garden. There's some more examples of this, so let's just, this is that same yard. Keep going. People of different generations, intergenerational collaboration as well, coming together, learning with each other, sharing their knowledge. So this is what's been happening with the work of the Food Forest Coalition, taking that anxiety and turning it into hope. In other words, so these spaces are seeds of hope. And just like a seed contains the entire oak tree, just like that acorn has the whole oak tree embodied in it, these are holistic. They're micro scale, but they're holistic in terms of addressing rainwater runoff and the urban heat island effect and reducing violence and stress in our neighborhoods, capturing and sequestering carbon. The list sort of goes on about the ways that they touch into everything that we're experiencing. So this is Jessie D'Amberville, who's building a food forest with her community in the Mattapan neighborhood, Edgewater Neighborhood Association. And the Edgewater Neighborhood Association is a good example. They came to us and they said, we want to make a food forest. Can you support that? And that's exactly why this land trust was created. And it really is a partnership with them. It really is their vision and their stewardship and their leadership that makes it happen. And we are entering in to support that sort of as the backbone, the nonprofit organization behind the scenes to help with technical assistance and fundraising and all the training that's necessary to make it go. But without folks like Jessie, this doesn't exist. And that's, I think, again and again, it's not a me thing. It's a we thing. And I wouldn't be the executive director doing this work if there weren't hundreds of other people, cheering it on and pouring their heart and soul into it. It just wouldn't have gone off the ground otherwise. And so we're coming to the end here. So the last point about what a food forest is that it's a beacon. It's a light. It's a blinking light in dark times. And it's shining a way. It's saying this is a way forward. It's an innovation. Let's go to the next slide. It's an innovation in green infrastructure and saying, how do we create high-density human habitats, i.e. cities, in a way that connects people with each other and connects us back to the land and connects us back to our souls and our mission as stewards of creation? How do we create beloved community here on earth? You know, thinking about the words of Martin Luther King. How do we make this come alive in our world now and today? The city of Boston is inspired by this work. So we have a good, tight relationship that's developed over the last 6 years with the Department of Neighborhood Development. And Sheila Dillon has really stepped up to say, you know, we've been looking for a community land trust because they have hundreds of parcels in their portfolio that they've evaluated are not suitable for housing and affordable housing, are not suitable for commercial development, and they're not intending to control and own these parcels. They want them to be repurposed for community use. So they're looking for partners. When we say we want to do 35, that's ambitious from our end. That's just a small wedge of the 200 parcels the city has available. So it's room for other organizations and other forms of innovation. We're not the only thing on the block, for sure. We fit into the whole ecosystem of activity in Boston, but it's an important, you know, chunk of that wedge, and it could grow from 35 slowly from that point forward. So we could eventually be 100 food forests in neighborhoods across Boston, each with their annual harvest festival, bringing people together. And how might that change the fabric of our neighborhoods and our community? And so we want to be a hub. We want to be able to support people in this work, teach people how to do this, be the nonprofit backbone that helps weave a community of practice and a web of mutual aid across neighborhoods so that folks doing this work in Dorchester get to know folks doing this work in Jamaica Plain and in East Boston and at the historic Old West End. I mean, that's already happening, and there's a lot more, obviously, to make that more real and more viable. So we think of ourselves as a 4-part model where we're the land trust. So we take literal deed to the land and we own the land and protect it in perpetuity. We are developing the food forest, so we're a real estate developer working with the neighbors, figuring out the design, getting the materials, hiring the subcontractors, creating the community work days. We are composed of stewardship teams. When we say we're a coalition and we're a community land trust, it's those stewards who are ultimately the beneficiaries of the trust and are ultimately the governors of the land trust if we succeed in developing our model as a democratic organization. And then we do a lot of education, and we don't just do it for the stewards. We reach people throughout Greater Boston. People come in from Worcester, and they come in from Waltham. They come in from everywhere to come and learn about backyard chickens and mushroom growing and soil restoration and fruit tree care. So this is part of that, weaving that web of community practice, and also connecting people with resources in the suburbs to people with less resources in the city and building that web of mutual aid and saying, oh, we're bigger than just the urban barrier of Boston, the urban border of Boston. We're in this interwoven community, right? And if we're going to create equity, we have to think regionally. And so here we are at the end of it. And I would just say that, you know, this is what I can share in a short period, and I'm happy to take questions, and really grateful that you invited me to share, and I hope that there's some inspiration here. And one of the things that we're really looking for are people who would want to partner with us. There's lots of different ways to get involved. That can be everything from volunteering on Wednesdays at the Boston Nature Center, which some folks I think were able to visit. And every Wednesday there's a stewardship team that's out there doing that work. So if you want to learn by doing and get your hands dirty, that's an easy way to plug in Wednesday evenings around 4 or 5, and then sometimes they picnic afterwards. There's a long-term volunteer from Lincoln who's come in to help build the Ellington Community Food Forest with the neighbors in Dorchester, and she's been there from the beginning, and she's still there, and those friendships and relationships deepen over time. So it could be adopting that sort of relationship as well and learning from that experience and seeing if there's one near you. It could be thinking of how to start one on a space that you are familiar with in your own neighborhood or your library or your school, whether with our support or just because we inspired you. I mean, and then obviously we do need financial support to grow, and we're looking for that type of partnership. So if you do have, you know, resources and you're looking for a way to get involved and support the community at this intersection of climate resilience and racial justice, we would love to have a multi-year partnership and figure out other ways to sort of weave that relationship. And so things that we've been doing this year is bringing people to tours of the spaces to meet the stewards. And we have another one on October 16th at the Ellington Community Food Forest. We did one in September at the Edgewater Food Forest. And it's a great way for us to say, hey, this is a community. We're all in relationship together. So with that, I'm going to be quiet and say, what are your questions?
Thank you so much, Orion. Wow, what a really rich and inspiring presentation. Great, we've got a question right here. If you can just give us your first name and your question. Okay, I'm just going to repeat that question. Is that better, William? I'm just going to repeat that question for the folks online, or those questions. There were two. So Charlotte asks, how does work like this help? How do you position people to make changes around their own personal diets? And what is the work of canopies and trees, particularly as it relates to food deserts in the Boston community? Is that more or less, Charlotte? Great. So how do you interface between food or tree canopies and food deserts? Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll just take the last part of your question about the tree canopy. We plant a lot of trees. We plant white oak trees, and then we teach people about how the acorns can be processed into acorn flour, and we lead workshops on that. So I think part of the vision here is that we're saying that you can plant a tree and you can have stuff in the understory of that tree that also thrives and grows, that's also meeting human needs. And that all of that together is what's going to impact things like the urban heat island and sequester carbon. Because when you do that and you restore the life in the soil itself will sequester carbon, maybe even more so than the tree does. And a lot of the challenges in cities is the compaction of the soil. So decompacting that soil, bringing life back into it, sort of jumpstarts nature, and nature sort of regenerates and does the rest. And so it absolutely is not the same as planting huge trees, because there are considerations about shade, and we have to sort of do good design. And sometimes in good design, you say, oh, well, let's plant some dwarf varieties of these fruit trees, because A, they're going to be reachable and accessible to people, easier to harvest. B, they're going to grow faster and produce food sooner. So when you put a little small whippet in the ground, it takes about 10 years before you really get the full impact of its food production. So if we're thinking about this, we're doing this definitely for future generations, just like people used to build cathedrals that were never completed in their lifetimes. We're building these gardens for future generations of Bostonians, and we're planting trees that are going to take 10, 15 years before they're really productive. But definitely we're thinking about sort of the range of that. And then the shade, it has to be thoughtful. So we do sometimes take out trees, but like at the Edgewater Food Forest, we try to take out like the Norway maples, the invasive trees that are sucking up the water and making it hard for other things to grow, but we left in the black walnuts. And some people are like, oh, you can't eat black walnuts, but that's not true. And Vivian Morris, who grew up in the South, she remembers cracking black walnuts as a kid. So we're building a walnut processing station in the food forest so that we can share that knowledge with adults and children in the neighborhood. And Oh no, it's not a single tree. These spaces are more than just, it's like there's trees throughout. So the example of the Ellington Garden, a lot of the trees are on the margin. It was unfortunately not totally visible in the picture, but they're also quite young and small still. So they'll grow bigger as they go. And some of these spaces, there's like at the Eggleston Garden, there's big oak trees in the back that we left intact, and then we plant the apple trees in front of them. So we're not only planting trees, but we definitely are prioritizing perennials and we're prioritizing sort of the range of things that can fit in these urban spaces. It's not necessarily in and of itself going to solve all the problems, but it's like part of, I would say, a significant part of the puzzle that needs to be clicked into place as we try to adapt our cities to the challenges of the heat island effect and also just other aspects of climate change in terms of rainwater, capturing that on site. The other question, part of your question, was about diet and how we help people or support people to think about changing their diet. I think there's a few pieces to that. One is we have done a little bit, like the acorn processing classes or making medicinal teas and things like that. So we do a little bit of direct educational workshops. We also partner with other organizations like Rounding the Bases, which works with elder folk and helps them do cooking classes. And so some of the food grown at the Ellington Food Forest has been donated to Rounding the Bases. And I think there's more we can do in terms of finding those partnerships, especially as we add staff capacity to really manage those relationships. But I think there's a lot more we can do also with youth. And one of the things that I've been surprised is when a young person comes into this garden and says, I didn't know that's what a strawberry plant looked like. I didn't, like this, you'd be surprised how disconnected we all are from nature, right? But especially young folks in the city, just discovering that and learning and being able to eat and know that it's safe to do so. So if you have a constrained food budget, it's expensive to buy raspberries at the supermarket. But if you can pick them next door, you're going to eat them, and you're going to find them in your diet more often, and you're going to talk to your neighbors. And that's the other thing that happens at the Ellington Garden is we had, in this street in Dorchester, we have people there who didn't know each other at all. You know, they're from the Caribbean, they're from Central Africa, they're from, you know, some of them have been on the block for 40 years, and they don't necessarily have relationships with each other, but then in the garden, they start sharing recipes. Oh, that's callaloo. Oh, how do you cook it? How do you grow it? And then that, I think, begins to build what I would call real community resilience, because you can stockpile as much food as you want in your basement, but if your neighbors are hungry, you're not going to be resilient. You know, you're only as resilient as your neighborhood. And so as people talk to each other and share that knowledge, I think that's the primary way that their diets will change. And I think about myself and how hard it is for me to do little habitual changes in my own life and eat better. And I'm just aware, like, this is not an easy process, right? So the more we do this in community with each other, I think the more that process gets reinforced.
Thanks, Orion. Thank you, Charlotte. So we'll go here and then here. So Catherine is asking, how do we navigate between enough space for plants to really thrive and enough people to really thrive in those plant spaces? Thanks, Catherine.
Yeah, I think that's what good design is, and I think that's like the principles of permaculture design is our three pieces. One is earth care, so real stewardship of the environment. One is people care, and real thinking about how we take care of each other. And one is fair share. Like those three core principles shape all of the design elements in a permaculture design. And then the exact way to balance that is tricky, you know, and every space is different. So some spaces are 10,000 square feet. That's quite large for the city. Some spaces are 4,000 square feet. So you're going to have less ability to navigate it. We like to use the resources that are already on site. So like I mentioned, when there's already walnut trees there, rather than cut those down and start over, can we incorporate that into the design? But then that, of course, limits what we're going to be able to do in terms of the physical layout if we work that way. And so, again, it really isn't so much our decision as it is the stewardship decision. And the stewardship teams vary. Some are very well organized, like the Edgewater Neighborhood Association, an amazing neighborhood association. Others come together around the space and they don't have an official entity. They're just a collection of neighbors, and they're learning as they go, and they're talking with their other neighbors. We do a lot of design work in terms of we do door knocking and canvassing that way. We've done surveys, online surveys, physical paper surveys to solicit people's opinions. We have multiple meetings. I've been involved directly in the design work where we draw a map and we share it with neighbors and they comment on it and they say what their priorities are, and then we redraw it and come back with that. We've also worked with groups like COG Designs, which is a clearinghouse for landscape architects to work pro bono with community-oriented projects, and they'll do the design work, and the neighbors will go back and forth with COG Designs, and once they have that design in place, then they'll come back to us, and we'll work with the neighbors to actually implement it. And then a lot changes in the implementation. So even though you have a good map and a good sense of things on paper, when you actually get onto the site and you start to dig up the land, you find that there's things you didn't expect. But we are trying to make these accessible to everybody. So it is important that they're ADA compliant. There's one site where that became really cost prohibitive because it's on a slant with a lot of pudding stone in it. And so we were working really hard with the neighbors to try to figure that out, but it really became a question of like, do you do something or nothing on this space? And so the city gave us permission in that case to do something. But those neighbors, you know, their goal is, this is in Savin Hill, and their goal is for the food to really feed the pollinators and the birds. So they're not looking for it to feed themselves or their neighborhood in the same way that other neighbors might. So it really depends on what the stewards want and what their goals are.
Thank you so much. Time for our last question.
Yeah, that's
Ralph,
a great question.
I'm sorry, just for our online community, Ralph is asking, what is the role of various organizations who might come to the Food Forest Coalition, and how does the Food Forest Coalition support that organization? Thanks, Ralph.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's part of the complication of our model, and so we are simultaneously a land trust and a coalition of food forests, but not every food forest is in the land trust. So Old West Church, for example, owns their own churchyard, and Boston Nature Center, that's Mass Audubon's urban wildlife sanctuary, they own their campus. So when we partner with an organization that already has a structure to it, we're primarily there as educators, I would say. Like with Old West Church, we've been helping to train those stewards, help them feel familiar with it. We also bring resources. So they had a real panic. They planted these fruit trees, and there's a lot of aphids. And they're like, oh, we need neem oil. We need to spray the aphids. And we sort of said, actually, you don't. And we brought a permaculture landscape consultant to the space to help them understand that, you know, ladybugs will come, and this aphid infestation was just normal amount of aphids, and it's not so scary, and things like that. We also help with fundraising. We've done like joint grant writing with groups. We point groups to get resources, so when they need small amounts of money to like do a community event, like the Food as Medicine event that the Ellington folks do every year, except during COVID, but they've been for years, every year having an annual event called Food as Medicine, and they'll partner with the local neighborhood health clinics and other groups to bring them there and have a fair with the face painting and the music and all of that. And the Riley Foundation was able to help support that at, you know, sort of a small level of money. And then I think the other thing that happens is there's ongoing maintenance challenges. And I think that's one of the innovations that we're offering. Is like, it's easy to build a park, but who's going to take care of it? And Boston Parks and Rec is a under-resourced, understaffed department in the city. So there's that challenge that the city has whenever they think about a new community space. Who's maintaining it? And what we're able to say is, we're the backstop. So if a key community leader retires or moves away, this space is not going, it might go through a period of not as well, you know, organized, and we definitely have encountered that, where things sort of, you know, ebb and flow. But we're going to be there to rebuild that stewardship team, connect that space with the neighbors, and ensure that it doesn't go into disrepair. And I think that helps the city, therefore, put its resources into building these spaces in the first place, because they can trust that that's happening.
Thank you so much, Orion. Thank you, everyone, for coming out and tuning in this afternoon. Just as a reminder, Orion is here in case once we wrap this officially. If you have remaining questions, do feel free to ask. You can also learn more at bostonfoodforest.org. Especially if we were able to get your email address, please stay tuned for a survey, a Google survey that will hopefully be coming your way really soon about this. So thank you so much for being here, Orion.
Yeah, thank you. It's great.
Thank you.
Do you want want this?
Right here.